The conference room on the 52nd floor of the Kessler Group tower didn't feel like a place where people made decisions. It felt like a place where decisions were made about people. And the difference, Colin Merritt had learned in the last 40 minutes, was everything. He sat at the far end of a table that could have seated 20, though only 8 chairs were occupied. All of them on the other side, all of them belonging to members of the Hargrove family, whose combined net worth eclipsed the GDP of small nations, and whose expressions right now ranged from polite condescension to something that didn't bother disguising itself as anything at all. The patriarch, Gerald Hargrove, silver-haired, 72, the kind of man who had never once in his life been told to wait, sat precisely in the center, his attorney to his left, his eldest son to his right, and a leather-bound contract positioned in front of Colin like a meal he hadn't ordered. $750 million, Gerald said, not reading from anything, just stating it the way someone might state the weather. Full acquisition. Operational integration begins within 90 days. Colin didn't reach for the contract immediately. He already knew what was in it. He'd spent 3 nights last week reading it line by line and then reading it again because the language was designed to be read quickly, to be skimmed in excitement, to have the number at the top function like a fog that made everything beneath it seem like fine print, but he had read it slowly. And what it said, underneath all the precision-crafted legalese, was that his company, the platform he had built from a rented garage in Columbus over 7 years, would belong to the Hargroves in every way that mattered. His name would remain on the letterhead, his title would remain. But every decision, every direction, every choice about what the product became and who it served and what it stood for would pass through a family that viewed his work the way a collector viewed an acquisition. He turned the first page. Gerald's son, Lawrence, leaned back in his chair in a way that suggested he had been leaning back in chairs like this his entire life and fully expected to continue doing so. "We've reviewed your last 3 quarters," he said. "Growth is solid, but the ceiling is obvious. You've taken this as far as someone in your position can take it." He paused just long enough to let that phrase do its work. Someone in your position. "What we're offering isn't just capital, it's infrastructure, access, the kind of network that doesn't open for independent operators." Colin looked up from the contract. Lawrence continued undeterred. "You built something useful. We're giving you the chance to cash out before the market corrects. That's not an insult. That's arithmetic." A quiet sound moved through the room. Not quite laughter, something more restrained than that, an acknowledgement passing between people who shared a language Colin wasn't supposed to speak. And Gerald said nothing. He simply watched, the way men watch things they've already decided they own. And Colin felt it then, not as anger, not yet, but as something colder and more clarifying than anger. The particular sensation of being assessed rather than addressed, of being in a room where the outcome had been determined before he arrived and the only question was how cleanly he would accept it. His hand moved without thinking, into his jacket pocket, fingers closing around his phone, and he didn't pull it all the way out, just enough to angle the screen, just enough to see the lock screen photo he'd set 3 months ago and hadn't changed since. His daughter, Audrey, 6 years old, gap-toothed smile, her hair in 2 uneven pigtails that she had insisted on doing herself that morning, and his hands were not good at pigtails, but she had declared them perfect, and he had believed her, because that was the kind of faith that went in both directions. She was sitting on the hood of his car in the photo, squinting into the sun, holding up a drawing she'd made of the 2 of them, which he had recognized as himself, only because she had labeled it Dad in capital letters. He looked at that photo for 2 seconds. Maybe 3, and something settled in him. Not rage. Not defiance. Something quieter than both. Something that felt like a door closing on one version of this moment and another one opening somewhere he hadn't expected. He set the phone back in his pocket. He looked up, he turned to the last page of the contract, and then he closed it. The sound was small, just paper against paper, but in the particular silence of that room it carried, and every head lifted, and Gerald's expression shifted by the smallest possible degree. "I appreciate the offer," Colin said. His voice was steady in a way that surprised even him. "But what you're describing isn't a partnership, it's a transfer, and what you'd be transferring isn't just a platform. It's 7 years of decisions about what this thing is supposed to do and who it's supposed to protect." He slid the contract back across the table, not dramatically, just returned it to the space it had come from. "I'm not selling that." The silence that followed had a different quality than the silence before it. Lawrence's jaw tightened. Gerald's fingers, which had been loosely laced on the table, pressed together slightly. And somewhere near the end of the row, one of the attorneys made a note, which was somehow the most unsettling sound in the room. "Mr. Merritt." Gerald's voice was still controlled, still patient, but something beneath it had changed register. You have 47 employees. You have a burn rate that your current revenue does not comfortably sustain. You have a product that operates in a regulatory environment that is about to become considerably more complicated. He paused. We have been generous with this offer. Generosity is not a posture we maintain indefinitely. Colin stood. He didn't push the chair back loudly. He didn't make a speech. He buttoned his jacket the way his father had taught him to do before leaving a room, and he said simply, "Then I guess we're done." And he walked out. The elevator ride down took 43 seconds. He counted them without meaning to, his reflection in the mirrored doors looking back at him like a question he hadn't finished answering. The lobby of the Kessler building was all marble and recessed lighting, and the low murmur of deals being made at every visible surface, and he walked through it without stopping, and the revolving door pushed him out into the late afternoon air of midtown Chicago, and the city came back at him all at once. Horns and wind and the smell of something frying from a cart 2 blocks away, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just standing, while the enormity of what he had just done began to take actual shape. His phone was already vibrating. He didn't look at it yet. He thought about Audrey instead. About the fact that she was at his sister's apartment right now, probably watching something with talking animals. Probably wearing her socks on the wrong feet, which she did consistently and with conviction. He thought about the drive home, how she would hear his keys in the door before he even turned the handle, how she would come running in a way that still, after 6 years, managed to catch him off guard every single time. He thought about her pigtails. He exhaled once, slow and deliberate, and then he looked at his phone. 14 messages. The first 3 from his CFO, Neil Baxter, whose name alone on a screen at this hour meant that word had already traveled faster than it should have. 2 from his head of product. 1 from an investor whose tone, visible even in a preview snippet, suggested that the specific combination of calm and urgency that people used when they wanted you to know they were not panicking, but also that you should understand the situation was serious. And the last message from an unknown number, just 11 words. The Hargroves don't lose gracefully. You should prepare yourself accordingly. He stared at that one for a long moment. Then he put the phone in his pocket and walked to his car. His sister's building was on the north side, and the drive took 25 minutes in traffic, and he used all of it to do nothing except pay attention to the road, because sometimes the most honest thing a person could do was simply not think, not yet, not before they had to. Audrey was at the window when he pulled up. He could see her from the street, small face pressed to the glass, palms flat. By the time he reached the 3rd floor, she had already opened the apartment door and was standing in the hall in her mismatched socks, her pigtails somewhat less structured than they had been this morning, but still present, still hers. "You came," she said, as though this had been in question. "I came," he confirmed. She grabbed his hand and pulled him inside with the focused urgency she applied to most things, and his sister Dana appeared from the kitchen, and their eyes met over Audrey's head. And Dana's expression asked a question. Colin answered with a slight shake of his head, meaning not now, later. And Dana nodded once and said, "There's food if you want it," which was its own form of care. Audrey had set up something on the living room floor, an elaborate arrangement of paper and crayons and what appeared to be a half-constructed city made from folded index cards. She pulled him down beside her with the casual authority of someone who had never doubted he would follow. "I'm building," she announced. "I can see that. It's a hospital, but also a school, but also a library." She considered this. Mostly it's a place where people can go when they need help. Colin looked at the index card structures, at the careful, slightly wobbly lines she'd drawn on them, at the sign she had lettered above one doorway that said "Welcome" with a missing E, and he felt something move through his chest that didn't have a precise name, but that was heavier than pride and steadier than grief, and had something to do with the specific terror and privilege of being responsible for a person this whole. "It's good," he said. She looked at him. She had her mother's eyes, the same directness in them, the same quality of actually seeing rather than just looking. "You look different," she said. "Do I?" "Like when the power went out that one time," she said. "Your face does the same thing." He didn't ask her to explain it. He understood what she meant. They stayed on the floor together for an hour, him helping to reinforce the index card walls while she narrated the lives of the imaginary people who would live in her building, and he listened, genuinely listened. And for that hour, the 47 employees and the 14 messages and the unknown number and the particular weight of Gerald Hargrove's patience all existed at a remove that felt, if not manageable, then at least not immediate. It was only later, driving home with Audrey asleep in her car seat, her chin dropped to her chest and one sneaker half off, that it came back fully. The magnitude of what the next weeks would mean. because Colin wasn't naive. He had not walked out of that room unaware of consequences. He had done it anyway because some calculations don't run on numbers, but that didn't make the numbers disappear. By the time he got Audrey into bed, shoes off, blanket up, the small lamp in the corner left on because she still preferred it that way, and he saw no reason to change that. His phone had accumulated 31 messages and 2 missed calls. He sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and read through them in order. Neil had called twice. The messages escalated from "call me" to "we need to talk tonight." 3 investors had reached out, 2 with concern, 1 with something that read closer to accusation. A journalist from a trade publication had emailed asking for comment on reports that the Hargrove acquisition had fallen through, which meant the story was already being written somewhere. And another partner, a firm that had been in conversation with Colin's company for 6 weeks about a significant integration deal, had sent a single-line message saying they were pausing discussions pending further review. He read that last one twice. He set the phone face down on the table and looked at the wall for a moment. He had known this was possible. He had known that walking away from the Hargroves wasn't just declining a check. It was declining a particular kind of protection, and that the absence of that protection would become visible very quickly to everyone watching the space he occupied. The Hargrove family had relationships in every direction. They sat on boards. They made introductions. They could delay things quietly, without fingerprints, and the market would interpret those delays as signals, and the signals would compound. And no single event would constitute proof of anything, but the pattern would be unmistakable to anyone paying attention. He was paying attention. He opened his laptop and pulled up the internal dashboard for his platform, the one that showed active users, system performance, the quiet hourly accumulation of data that confirmed people were finding the thing he'd built useful enough to keep coming back to. Numbers he had memorized the way other people memorized sports statistics or song lyrics. The product was healthy. The product was, if anything, at an inflection point. He had spent the last 8 months building toward a capability release that no one outside his core team had seen yet, a predictive layer that would change what the platform could do in ways that were not incremental. He had been deliberate about keeping it close. He had not been ready to show it under the terms the Hargroves had been proposing, which was, if he was being honest with himself, part of why he had walked away. Not the main part, but part. He closed the laptop at midnight. He stood at Audrey's door for a moment before going to bed, watching her breathe in the half-light. And what he felt was not reassurance exactly, but something adjacent to it. The reminder that the reason the stakes were high was the same reason the decision had been uncomplicated. Those 2 things could be true at the same time. The next morning, Neil Baxter was already in the conference room when Colin arrived at 7:15, which told him everything he needed to know about how Neil had spent the night. 3 other members of the leadership team were with him, and the atmosphere when Colin walked in was the specific atmosphere of people who had been discussing someone before that person arrived. Neil didn't waste time. 3 partners in the last 18 hours, he said. 1 hard pause, 2 soft declines. Harrington Group sent a message this morning about timing concerns on the infrastructure contract. That contract was supposed to close in 11 days. Colin sat down. "They're not coming after us directly," said Priya, his head of operations, whose ability to read patterns in data had saved the company real money twice and was now being applied to a different kind of pattern. "But the pauses are coordinated. Same language in 2 of the messages. That doesn't happen organically." "No," Colin agreed. "It doesn't. So they're pushing on our relationships," Neil said. His voice was controlled, but the control was doing work. "And if this continues, our runway changes, our options change." He stopped. Started again. "Colin, tell me there was a reason." The room held still. "There was a reason," Colin said. "Then explain it to me like I'm one of the 47 people whose mortgage depends on this company not collapsing." Colin looked at him. Looked at all of them. At the faces of people who had made specific bets with specific portions of their lives, based on specific trust in his judgment. That weight was real. He did not want to minimize it. He had not minimized it when he was standing in the Hargrove conference room, and he would not minimize it now. The contract gave them directional veto over product decisions within 18 months of close, he said. Not operational veto, directional. Meaning what this product is for, what problems it solves, who it serves. Those decisions would have passed to a family that makes infrastructure investments and views user protection as a liability column. He paused. "You know what we built. You know who uses it. You know why they use it." Several people in the room ran social welfare software integrations. They all knew what he meant. "I didn't walk away from money. I walked away from handing them the ability to undo what this is supposed to be." Silence. Neil exhaled through his nose. "That's a principles," he said. Principals don't make payroll. No, Colin said, but the release does. A few people looked up. The capability update, he said. I'm moving the timeline. Priya leaned forward slightly. You said Q3, I'm saying now. He looked around the table. Not the full release, a controlled preview. Enough to show the right people what's coming and change the conversation we're having from what happened with the Hargroves to what does Merritt have that we need. The room shifted. Not resolved, not yet, but differently weighted. How long do you need, Neil asked. 2 weeks, Colin said. Maybe less. Neil was quiet for a long moment. He had been with Colin since the company had 12 employees and operated out of a space that smelled permanently of cold brew and printer toner, and the quality of his silence in moments like this was something Colin had learned to read accurately. 2 weeks, Neil said finally. Don't make me regret this more than I already do. The next 11 days moved differently than days had been moving. Not faster, exactly, but more compressed, like the space between heartbeats narrowing. Colin worked early and late and found the specific focus that comes when the margin for error is small enough that distraction becomes a luxury you simply cannot afford. His team, to their credit, held together. The engineers working on the capability update had been waiting for this, and the controlled urgency of a moved timeline turned out to focus them rather than fracture them. At home, the routine continued. Dinner at the small table in the kitchen. Audrey's homework spread across half of it. Her commentary on the events of her day, which she delivered with the same consistency and detail regardless of what was happening in the adult world around her, and which Colin found, night after night, to be one of the most stabilizing forces available to him. She was learning about weather in school, and for a week she narrated the atmospheric conditions of every meal with scientific authority that was mostly invented but delivered with complete confidence. He did not correct her. He listened and ate and was present, and that was the most important thing he could do, and also, some evenings, the hardest. He did not tell her what was happening. She was 6. She would know something was heavier than usual. She was perceptive in that animal way children sometimes are. But the specifics were not hers to carry. And he was careful about that. Careful in a way that required constant calibration. When she asked why he was on his phone after her bedtime, he said he had things to figure out. And she said okay. And then she said, from somewhere under her blanket, "You always figure things out. Dad," and he turned off her light and stood in the hallway for a moment and held on to that sentence like it was something he could use later, like it was a supply he could draw from. On the 13th day, an email arrived from Hargrove Capital's legal office. Not Gerald himself, not Lawrence, but their communications director, which was its own signal. The subject line read, "Reconsidering options, request for discussion." The tone was formal but different. The specific kind of different that happens when something unexpected has entered a room and the people in it are recalculating without wanting to admit they are recalculating. The controlled preview had reached the right people. Colin read the email twice. Then he called Neil. "I saw it," Neil said before Colin could speak. "What do you think?" "I think they heard about the preview. I think someone they respect told them something they didn't expect. And I think they want back in the room before we stop needing them to be in it. That's what I think, too." A pause. "You're going back in there, aren't you?" "Yes." Neil was quiet for a moment, then different terms, completely different terms. This time, Colin arrived at the Kessler building early. He took the elevator up without counting seconds. He walked into the conference room before the Hargroves did, and he chose a seat near the center of the table, not at the end. He set his briefcase on the table. He opened it. He removed a single folder, not thick, not theatrical, just a folder, and he placed it at his own elbow and left it closed. Gerald Hargrove entered the room with Lawrence and their lead attorney, and their expressions were careful in a way that yesterday's expressions had not been. Gerald sat. He looked at Colin. He looked at the folder. He did not reach for it. "Mr. Merritt," he said, "thank you for agreeing to meet." "Of course," Colin said. Lawrence said nothing at first. Then, "We've heard some things. I imagine you have. The capability your team is previewing," Lawrence said. "It wasn't in the materials you shared with us during due diligence." "No," Colin agreed. "It wasn't ready to share, it's ready now? It's ready enough to show that it changes what the platform is worth, and what it's worth to the right partners." He let that word sit for a moment. "Partners, not buyers." Gerald's jaw tightened slightly. It was a small movement, barely there, but Colin had become attentive to small movements. "You're here to renegotiate. I'm here to have a conversation we didn't have the first time," Colin said, "about what a genuine partnership looks like. Not a transfer of control with a ceremonial title attached. A partnership, revenue share structure, independent product direction, defined boundaries on integration that protect what the platform is and what it does." He opened the folder then and slid a single page across the table. I've outlined the framework. It's not a take it or leave it. It's a starting point. Lawrence picked up the page. His expression moved through something that might have been surprise before settling back into neutrality. He passed it to Gerald. Gerald read it without expression. He read it a second time, more slowly. He set it down. He looked at Colin for a long moment the way he had looked at him in the first meeting, but differently the assessment this time aimed at something other than weakness. You came back, Gerald said. Not a question. Not approval exactly. Something more like acknowledgement. I came back for something worth agreeing to, Colin said. Across the table, Lawrence and their attorney exchanged a look that Colin didn't try to decode. And then Gerald said something that he had not said in their first meeting, had clearly not planned to say in any meeting, had perhaps not said to many people in rooms like this one in a very long time. Walk me through it, he said. They were in the room for 3 hours. The conversation was not easy. There were points of friction that were real, not strategic, and moments where the distance between positions seemed like it might not close, and Colin did not try to smooth over those moments or hurry past them. He sat in them and said what he meant, and the Hargrove attorneys pushed back and he pushed back on the pushback, and it was slow and honest and nothing like the first meeting, which had not been a conversation at all. When they finally finished, nothing was signed. But the framework was no longer just his. It was marked up, annotated, argued over, and it was a different document than the one he'd walked in with, and that was the point. Gerald stood when the meeting ended, and Colin stood, and they shook hands, and Gerald's grip was the same grip as before, but its meaning had changed. The way the same word in 2 different sentences means 2 different things. We'll have our team follow up, Gerald said. I'll be available, Colin said. Lawrence walked him to the elevator. Unprecedented. Colin noted it without commenting on it. They stood waiting in the hallway, and Lawrence, who had said very little in the last hour that wasn't routed through counsel, said quietly, "The single page. Did you write it yourself?" "Yes," Colin said. Lawrence was quiet for a moment. It was well written, he said, which, from Lawrence Hargrove in a hallway outside a room where he had just been outmaneuvered, was a statement that cost him something to make. The elevator arrived. Colin stepped in. He turned and faced front, and the doors closed. He did not count seconds this time. When he picked Audrey up from school that afternoon, she announced immediately that she had won something called the Meteorology Medal, which was not an official school award, and had in fact been entirely invented by her teacher to give to the student who had asked the most questions about clouds that week, and which Audrey was treating with the same gravity she would have accorded an Olympic gold. She held up the paper certificate the whole drive home, rotating it to catch the light from different angles. "You have to put it on the refrigerator," she told him. "Agreed," he said, next to the drawing. He had put her drawing on the refrigerator months ago, the one she'd made of the 2 of them outside his office building, him in a jacket, her holding his hand, both of them with enormous circular heads and expressions of pure satisfaction. He had moved it through 3 apartment iterations, and it had lost a corner somewhere along the way and gained a small smudge of green crayon in the upper left, and it was still on the refrigerator. He taped the meteorology medal next to it when they got home. Audrey stood back and assessed the arrangement with her hands on her hips. "Good," she said. He made dinner. She set the table which she had recently decided was her responsibility, performing this task with a seriousness that suggested international diplomacy was being practiced. They ate and she told him about clouds, specifically about how cumulonimbus clouds were the biggest and most dramatic and could cause lightning, which she delivered as a warning he should be aware of. "I'll watch out for them," he promised. "You should," she said. "They sneak up." Later, after she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside him and looked at the refrigerator, at the drawing and the certificate side by side, at the green smudge and the missing corner, and the paper medal that had been invented for a 6-year-old who asked too many questions about clouds. He thought about the room he had left today, and the one he had left 11 days ago, and the distance between those 2 exits and what had made that distance possible. Not the capability release, not the framework he'd drafted, not the leverage he'd built in those 11 days. All of that mattered, but it was not the thing. The thing was something that had happened in the first meeting, when his hand had moved without his permission into his pocket, and his fingers had found his phone, and the screen had shown him a 6-year-old with uneven pigtails and a declaration of faith in his handwriting ability. That moment hadn't given him a strategy. It had given him a floor. A place below which he was not willing to go regardless of what it cost, and having that floor had made every decision after it cleaner. Not easier, not less frightening, but cleaner, the way the air gets after a storm. He thought about something Audrey had said weeks ago, during one of the evenings when she'd been doing her drawings, and he'd been trying not to visibly worry. She'd looked up at some point out of nowhere and said, "When things are hard, you just keep doing the next thing." He had asked where she'd heard that, and she'd looked at him like the question was strange. "From you," she'd said. He didn't remember saying it. Probably he hadn't said it in those words. But she had distilled it from somewhere, from the aggregate of watching him move through the days, and she had handed it back to him, and it turned out he needed it. The agreement would take weeks to finalize. There would be friction in those weeks, and probably some days where the friction felt like too much, and the outcome was still not guaranteed in the way that outcomes are rarely guaranteed when you have declined to give away the thing that makes you hard to replace. But the conversation had changed. The room had changed, and he had not changed in the ways that would have required him to become someone his daughter wouldn't recognize, which was the only version of success he was certain he needed. He washed his mug. He turned off the kitchen light. He checked the lock on the front door and the window latch in Audrey's room, and the small nightlight she still kept plugged in by her dresser, the one shaped like a crescent moon that had been a gift from a woman he had loved and lost and who had given him, among many things, the understanding that the people you lose don't disappear from your life so much as change form within it. He stood in Audrey's doorway for a moment, listening to her breathe. And what he felt was not triumphant, not relieved, not even particularly peaceful, because those were clean emotions, and real life rarely offered clean emotions. What he felt was something less resolved and more human than any of those words. Something that had to do with being exactly here, in this doorway, in this apartment, with this particular child sleeping 4 feet away, having made the decisions that had brought him to this specific moment. He had not solved everything. He had not secured everything. He had not become untouchable. But he had not sold what mattered in order to be safe, and he had not let the fear of losing everything persuade him that everything was the same as anything. He went to bed. In the morning, Audrey would wake up and ask him what clouds were forming outside, and he would look out the window and describe whatever he saw, accurately or not, and she would evaluate his answer with the seriousness of someone who had won a meteorology medal. And breakfast would happen, and the day would begin, and the work would continue, and the outcome would continue to be uncertain. He was not afraid of uncertain. He had been teaching that to her, and she had handed it back, and now it was something they both knew how to carry.